Hello Advanced Higher Historians, and welcome to the next lesson for Advanced Higher History, which is the troubled years of Russia from 1905 to 1914, because apparently so far there hasn't been much trouble, if you would believe that. So we're starting off after the 1905 revolution and looking at the lead up to our kind of first main area of the topic for the exam, which is the 1914 kind of war area, and then into the first revolution in February 1917. The downfall of the Tsar is one of the sort of first questions that you can be asked in the exam, so this section kind of gives you that background element to that and gives you this idea of what started to go very wrong after the revolution that never was in 1905. So a couple of things for this lesson. We're still thinking about why the Tsarist regime collapsed, and we're still in Russia and Revolution. There's one learning intention at this point in time, thinking about the Tsarist regime surviving between 1906 and 1914, and could it really have continued to survive? We're in chapter 3 of the textbook. Again, if you haven't downloaded the textbook or you've not got the digital copy of the textbook, what have you been doing? Because like most of the tasks have been from there so far, so make sure that you do have that, and if you're struggling to find it, let me know and I will send it to you on the team or email it to you. Interesting to see where everybody's political alignment came out with after the last task, so that's quite interesting. We'll have a chat about that at our next live drop-in, and you can see kind of what you're thinking in more detail. So overview wise, the Tsarist regime has survived, and the Tsar has survived the 1905 revolution with Tsarism really largely intact, but there are some serious questions that remain, mostly to do with this idea of reform and the problems therein, and modernisation of the country, and just generally of politics and things at this point in time. It gives a high possibility of another revolution if he doesn't buck up his ideas, pull his socks up, whatever you want to say. Basically, if the Tsar doesn't give the reform that he has promised in the October Manifesto, which we will come back to, and try to at least satisfy some of this discontent within the groups that had pretty much been the foundation of the 1905 revolution, he's going to face another revolution much sooner than he maybe would like, which is obviously not what he wants, considering he's just survived this one. Peter Stolpen is going to be the one that comes in to offer the best chance of survival and achieving these reforms, but he later gets assassinated in 1911, and we'll come back to him in a little bit more detail. His major reforms are in agriculture, but really it's unclear how successful these were, so I'm going to get you to do a task looking at that in a bit more detail. And industry is continuing to grow, but this growth is very uneven and rather unbalanced. There's not very much actually done to improve the working lives of the people, and there's a lot of industrial unrest in the years leading up to 1914 and the outbreak of World War I. So that's kind of where we are and what we're looking at so far. So in terms of what really happens for the Tsar during these troubled years and how he manages to maintain his control, you can see a nice diagram here from BBC Bite Size, which is really good. After 1905 he reasserts his power as this sort of main autocratic leader. There is the October Manifesto, we've got the Gemmas to talk about, and how he then suppressed political opposition. We've got these economic reforms that we're referring to discuss, and also the fundamental laws that the Tsar then puts in place. This is a really nice mind map if you're thinking about how the Tsar manages to reassert his power after 1905. I would maybe suggest that you make a copy of this, because it is quite a nice way to kind of see the main areas. And if you were ever to do an essay questions practice on the troubled years and how the Tsar reasserted his power, this would be the kind of factors that we would be talking about that you could pick from. So just as a reminder then, the October Manifesto really and the fundamental laws. We've got Sergei Witt pictured here, who was the influential sort of policy maker. He was the one that persuaded the Tsar to passed the October Manifesto in 1905, and in it it's really promising a significant political reform happening throughout Russia. Although a lot of these promises that are actually made in it are quite open to interpretation, so there's a lot of kind of grey area in what these laws and these things in the October Manifesto are really promising. So they basically can be whatever the Tsar decides that they should be, pretty much, is what he gets free rein to do. Out of the main things though, he promises a Duma, which was going to be an elected national parliament, and this was going to be set up. No law was going to be passed unless it was approved by the Duma. However, it doesn't necessarily say who's allowed to elect these people, which people are allowed to get a vote, which people are allowed to stand for office, things like that. Censorship would be loosened off and more freedom of speech would be encouraged, but it doesn't say what types of censorship and whether or not that would extend to political freedoms of speech, which are very different than just general freedoms of speech. So that again is a grey area. And the people would have more rights to gather for discussions and meetings, but again, that does not necessarily mean that political groups are allowed to meet now, whereas they were obviously thinking that that was something that they wanted, because there's now more of a political compass and more of a political understanding in Russia starting to develop. So a lot of different grey areas there for us to think about. When the manifesto had come out, there was a lot of different reactions to it, and each different political group had a rather varied reaction. The liberal groups were very satisfied with the level of reform in the manifesto because it was what they wanted, and it was something that they were quite happy to then leave alone. So as far as they were concerned, this had been enough for them. They had achieved the goals that they initially set out to do. The cadets, which is roughly made up of the richer peasants, they are happy, but they want it to go slightly further. They want a written constitution, they want guarantees of a constituent assembly. They're wanting kind of more than what this is giving them, and they want an end to some of the grey areas that are there as well. The socialist revolutionaries, on the other hand, or the SRs, they're very critical of the manifesto. The Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks are very much along those lines as well, very angry about it. It didn't really give them any more power to the workers or the peasants, which were their main kind of focus groups. And in fact, you could then argue that because the workers and the peasants were the ones that had really been fighting in this kind of revolution in 1905, it gave them nothing really. So it was a bit of a failure on that part. Generally, as a response, the October Manifesto did a couple of things. It was a sort of a placating sort of gesture from the Tsar. It made the very angry people slightly less angry. It was kind of the equivalent of Nicholas handing them all a Snickers and telling them to stop being divas when they were hungry and just leave that to kind of sit and calm down. It was kind of like buying time really, and they were convinced he would do good on his promises and make good on these promises that he was making. What it definitely did do was it divided the opposition groups. Now, up to 1905, they have very much been on the same side. They maybe want slightly different spectrums of things, but they want the same thing. And they are against the Tsar, and that is very much, it's us versus him, and they are very much together on this. After the October Manifesto in 1905, these groups are divided quite far apart in what they expected and what they were thinking about for a revolution. So it makes the Tsar's grip on power more secure, because it means that these groups are not going to come together in the same way again to try and make revolution happen. And indeed, looking forwards to what happens in February 1917, they're not actually going to try to do this together in the same way, which ultimately will become an issue later on. So it does divide the people up quite far. So the October Manifesto is there in place, and then in 1906, in April, the Tsar passes something called the Fundamental Laws. It was an edict basically from the Tsar that confirmed what the October Manifesto had said, but also at the same time added these kind of other areas where the Tsar was almost asserting his power over these new things that he was developing, for example the Duma. So in it in particular he said that the right to rule independently of the Duma for him was there when it was not in session. So if the Duma was not in session, he could just rule independently. He didn't have to ask their permission to pass laws, which kind of made them a little bit null and void, really. He also has the right to dissolve or close the Duma at any point for any reason that he feels like. He has the power to change the electoral system, so he can choose who gets to vote for the Duma, and whoever he chooses one time might not be the same people the next time, just depending on what mood he's in. He also has the power to appoint ministers that he wanted into the council, so that could mean that he could put whoever he wanted wherever he wanted, just as he could as well. He retained this position as the sole commander of the army and the navy, which pretty much gave him full access to all military powers. Should there be any further uprising, he would be able to stop it. And pretty much what this meant was that even though he had made concessions which had saved his skin in the October Manifesto, he had then used the fundamental laws to reaffirm his position as the sort of the head of the pile. So just in case anybody was thinking he'd gone slightly soft, or that these things meant that he had weakened his sort of grip on things, this was him pretty much showing that he was still there and he still had a firm grip on control in Russia at this point in time. So the new government then for Nicholas, obviously because of this October Manifesto and the promise of a constitutional monarchy, a new government structure has to be adopted. Now, like we saw in the fundamental laws, the Tsar is going to remain the head of the government, but he's now going to be aided by 3 permanent political bodies which are going to be introduced. The first one is the Council of Ministers. This is definitely the most powerful of these 3. It effectively was just the Tsar's advisors, and they were elected by the Tsar, and they were answerable only to the Tsar, and they created law. So basically he put his advisors, who were already his advisors, into this new fancy title and continued to do what they were doing. Anyway, the second group was the State Council, who was going to be chosen by both the Tsar and the Zemvesta, which is the Council of Ministers. They are going to approve the laws that the Council of Ministers create, and pretty much again more or less the same thing. The Tsar appoints them. And then we have the Duma. Now this one was going to be the slightly more, we'll call it democratic, because it was going to be voted for by the male electorate. So no women voting here, just the males, and they would be the ones that had to approve the laws that were created before they became official laws, which sounds like a perfect example of democracy, except for the fact that the Tsar's fundamental laws mean that he can change who the electorate are when he wants. He can put people in to be voted for by the people that he is choosing to vote. So realistically, it's not maybe quite as democratic as they initially intended for it to be, or that it looks like on paper. So there were 4 Dumas in the period of the troubled years. So between 1906 and 1914, we've got 4 of them. The Duma deputies who gathered for the very first meeting, and you can see the picture on the slide is of the first meeting as it was set up in 1906, were quite hopeful. They thought they would be able to steer the Tsar on this new bright and shiny course for Russia, and that it was going to be a great sort of journey and it was going to be fantastic, and they had all these really great hopes and dreams which were quite quickly dashed. They were quite disappointed very quickly, because the Tsar used the fundamental laws to basically continue ruling without really taking much serious notice of them. They were more or less a kind of figurehead group that were there purely to stop people from moaning at him, more or less. The first 2 were quite strong opposition to Tsarism, and they were quite quickly dissolved within weeks and then months, each one, which we'll look at in more detail. The next 2 were slightly less radical and more flexible because the changes to the voting system had been made, which meant that they were slightly more on the Tsar's side. So, Duma number 1. It's established in May 1906, after the announcement of the Fundamental Laws. It consisted mainly of cadets and socialist revolutionaries, hence it demanded further political reform, as we saw in the reactions. It demanded that land reform was put out, it wanted political prisoners released, and it took these things to the Tsar, who told them, no thank you, no way. They then became quite, we'll say grumpy. They became quite grumpy with the Tsar because he was denying all of these things that they were trying to put forward, and it lasted just over 2 months before it was dissolved by a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister, who was there at the time. The Tsar being the one that kind of helped start that off. So the first Duma is now done, and we're moving on to Duma number 2. The second Duma established in February 1907, which, if you think about it, if the first one is in May 1906 and then is dissolved 2 months later, which obviously means that there is no Duma for quite a considerable period of time, where Nicholas just does what he likes. A lot of the cadets following the dissolving of the very first Duma had been involved in writing an appeal about it to try and get it put back. It criticised the government, basically the second Duma. It demanded the non-payment of taxes, and in response, these cadets who were campaigning were made illegible to vote. So the power of the cadets were suddenly very, very much gone. They didn't have any vote to the second Duma at all. This meant it was the liberal Octoberists, these are the ones that had agreed with the October Manifesto, because not all liberals did, the majority did, so the Octoberists definitely did. They had more influence, as did the socialist revolutionaries, as well as the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, gaining more and more support, with the cadets being kind of fetlocked at this point in time. This second Duma does a little bit better. It lasts for 5 months. So roughly, say July or so, they start to dissolve as well. And the reason for its dissolving was pretty much members began promoting this kind of revolutionary organisations within the army, so groups that would meet and would not be maybe as keen on the idea of the Tsar being in complete control and the officers that he was appointing being in complete control. And the Tsar didn't like this and saw it as a threat, so dissolved the second Duma. So the third Duma then takes over. It's a very tiresome amount of Dumas. This is then established again in 1907, and it was initially intended to be much more supportive of the Tsar, because in 1907 the Tsar changed the voting rules so that his opponents could not be elected to the Duma because they could not vote, or they could not be voted for. Arrangements had been made for landowners to have more voting power, so this meant that only the most affluent third of the population was actually even able to vote in this election at all. The result of this was a much more kind of peaceful, less radical and more favourable Duma for the government, and a new Prime Minister being able to be put in, which is Peter Staupen. He's then going to be able to pass a lot of land reform and things like that. And they do quite well because they last until the sort of mid-1912 period, which is not too bad. But by 1912, even this kind of loyal set-up Duma is becoming more and more critical of the Tsar's ministers and the policies that they are following. However, the problem it finds when it starts to actually become more critical is that it actually doesn't have any real power to change these things, and that criticism alone is not going to be enough of a threat to the regime or to the Tsar for any change to really happen. So the Tsarist regime continues, and again they're back to being a bit grumbly and more or less ignored in the background of the Tsar as he does his thing. So the fourth and final Duma, established in November 1912, This fourth Duma comprised mainly of Octoberists on one side and socialists on the other. And basically it was a divided Duma. It made decision making really very, very difficult because you had the people who were very much in support of the Tsar versus these people who were very much not in support of the Tsar, and it pretty much just put itself into deadlock, making it really difficult to do anything. They couldn't unite on any policies or any sort of points they were trying to make, so progress was very, very difficult. And ultimately this Duma was suspended in 1915, by which time the First World War is well underway and Russia is now committed to fighting the Austrians and the Germans during that period. So the Great Duma kind of experiment more or less fails, really. So wondering maybe why we just don't get rid of the Duma altogether. If we're the Tsar and we're putting all of these different roadblocks up for these things, why not just get rid of it? There's three main reasons for this. The first is that he's bound by this agreement he's made in October, in the October Manifesto, and if he ditched it, he was really frightened that there would be a popular uprising and an issue that he would then have to deal with in more detail, which he didn't want to have to do. The second is that Britain and France are Russia's allies by this point in the kind of international arena, and the Tsar really wanted to kind of show that he was more democratic and that Russia was more democratic by having this parliament the same as they did, and it meant that his allies trusted him a little bit more. So he's very loath to get rid of it when it's kind of the one thing that he's showing change and development in this political arena with. It would make him weak as far as he was concerned. Also, he had changed the elected system to make the Duma more docile, so he didn't actually think of it as much of a threat, to be honest. It was almost as if he declawed it, and there wasn't really much that he could do, or sorry, they could do, because he'd made sure of that. Which meant there was no need for him to get rid of it altogether. He could keep it there as a kind of a figurehead sort of thing that he could roll out in front of people when he needed to be like, wow, look how democratic we are, and it kept the people kind of back in their boxes because they thought he was doing what they had asked him to do. So that's why he doesn't get rid of it altogether. He needs to keep it, but it doesn't really have any real authority or power or control over anything. Other reasons why he doesn't actually feel like he needs to get rid of the Duma as well is because of how brutally he had actually suppressed the 1905 revolution, and it meant that he had felt quite secure about the kind of political goings on within his country, so he felt he didn't really need to get rid of the Duma too badly because it was very unlikely they were going to rise up against him. So obviously we know that in 1905 the army had stayed loyal to the Tsar and was used to basically crush any sort of opposition in the cities. In December of 1905, the Tsarist forces pretty much moved against all of the workers who had formed Soviets, so committees made up of workers and soldiers in St. Petersburg and Moscow. Fighting broke out between the army and the strikers in Moscow, and by the middle of that month the army had suppressed the strike and killed over 1,000 people. This meant that with the army on side, it was very unlikely that pretty much anyone was going to rise up too much against the Tsar other than just sort of political grumbling. However, the Union of Russian People was actually established to try and fight against what they saw as any sort of revolutionary groups. And the Tsar gave them the power to arrest, sentence and execute anyone who they thought had committed crimes against the state. So terrorist groups such as the Black Hundreds were then used to intimidate and attack anyone who was opposed to the Tsar. During the sort of second Duma's reign, again, remember they're slightly more radical, the Okhrana, the secret police, arrested Bolshevik and Menshevik representatives of the Duma who were attempting to develop this opposition within the army. They had this idea that if they could get the army to rise up, then he wouldn't be able to survive another revolution, which is what they had seen in the sort of brutal suppression methods. And the Okhrana had arrested quite a number of them for this before it was eventually dissolved. any uprising could potentially be threatening for the Tsar, and the control of the army was essential in suppressing any sort of revolution, which he needed more than he needed anything else. The impact of this sort of sheer forceful suppression on the revolutionary groups pretty much exposed that the Bolshevik Party and some others in particular did still have revolutionary plans that they were trying to get to happen in Russia, and it eventually forced one of the more famous names that we're going to look at, Lenin, into exile in 1907. Now, he would not return to Russia for 10 years. He'd still continue writing and things like that over this time in exile, but he was gone from Russia for that 10-year period before he comes back in 1917. There's show trials and sort of summary executions, basically, that had a serious impact on these revolutionary groups because it reduced their numbers. And by 1910, the numbers of membership for these revolutionary groups, either because of trials, because of executions, or because of exiles and things like that, had reduced from 100,000 to 10,000 in the space of only sort of 3 years, which is a huge number. Stoplin starts to get a name for himself as this kind of executioner. The hangman's noose becomes known as Stoplin's necktie because it was a famous method of fear and oppression that the Tsar used the Duma to kind of hold over these revolutionary groups that were trying to gain some sort of political footing with the Tsarist regime. However, they did actually survive. The revolutionary groups survived underground. They did continue to attract support and things which would become important later on as we go on with this. And eventually they managed to assassinate Stoplin in 1911, which we'll come back to briefly. So we've mentioned him an awful lot. This is the man himself, and you all know how much I do love a picture of a interesting looking guy with an interesting beard, but here he is. Appointed in 1906, like we said, this is going to be a tough Prime Minister. He's going to use a carrot and stick policy to keep control of Russia. The stick, as we've said, is this kind of hard repression of any sort of strikers, protesters or revolutionaries. There's over 20,000 exiled and 1,000 hanged under his sort of jurisdiction and his command. Again, back to this idea of the neckties. And really brutal suppression, which pretty much kept any sort of real opposition to the Tsar down up until 1914. So he did his job quite effectively with the stick element of things. The carrot is the kind of point he's trying to win over the peasants with. Now, he is very aware, as are most people at this point in time, that the peasants always wanted land. So he allowed the wealthier peasants, the kulak groups, to opt out of mere communes and to buy land, and allowed them to prosper. Now, in the process, what this did was it created larger and more effective farmland, and it increased the production significantly in agricultural regions, which is what he was probably the most famous for. So his agrarian reforms, obviously he wants to make sure that in order to modernise Russia and make it more competitive with the European powers, he's going to have to actually fund this somehow and going to have to do something about it. And agriculture is the area that he starts to target. What he really hoped was that if he reorganised the land, he would increase support for the Tsar among these kind of unskilled farmhands, amongst these peasants, and it would reduce the threat of the socialist revolutionaries who had the ear of the urban workers and the urbanite people in Russia at this point in time. So he believed that the key to success was to basically increase the number of peasants who were then landowners, which would result in the peasantry being more invested in the Tsar and what the Tsar had to say in the more liberal groups rather than the socialist revolutionary groups. Ultimately, what he changed was the redemption payments. So the loans from the state that they had been complaining about were abolished. They gave loans to the peasants to buy land, with the introduction of what he referred to as the peasants' land banks. So you could get a loan, buy your land, and then you were paying back about half of what your redemption payment would be to the bank, but then that land became yours and you owned it at the end. He also set up the mirs and the communities as a kind of no longer being a main focus point for them. He made this point that they could no longer stop individuals from leaving to buy private land, and if they did not cooperate, these communities of peasant farmers, then he dissolved them and he sold the land off to the peasants who could actually do it. Other peasants were also given financial incentives, basically to move to remote areas of Siberia, into areas where there was maybe potentially viable soil that they could then open up the countryside to more agricultural growing and more peasants that could work there. Ultimately, the result of this was that agricultural output actually increased by about a third, while the peasant land ownership increased by about 30%. The number of cadets increased dramatically, and again, remember, these are the wealthy peasants, and suddenly there was a huge, overwhelming amount of support from these cadets to the Tsar, because now they could be landowning and wealthy peasants as a result of these reforms. So he did kind of almost give the Tsar an entire group of people to support him that would not have existed otherwise. In terms of industrial progress, it was generally hoped that the agrarian reforms would pretty much reduce the demand for labour in the countryside, so it meant that more and more people could come in to the cities as people would flood in looking for work in this kind of area as well. And as a result of this, he increased the heavy industries quite considerably. The production of iron and steel rose about 50%, and by the start of World War I, Russia has really firmly cemented itself as the fourth biggest producer of steel, coal and iron amongst the superpowers that are there, which is, if you're going to go to war, is a fantastic position to be in. So he increases this, but also means that by increasing the amount of people coming into work and giving them this job and success in these jobs, actually he's increasing the number of people in the cities that are going to support the Tsar as well, reducing the amount of people that the revolutionaries kind of have got on their side. As you can kind of see here, between kind of the early period of Tsar's regime, sort of 1890 up to 1913, you can see how each of these industrial and agricultural production points are starting to rise. So the grain is the yellow line, that's, you know, skyrocketing up with the more and more people owning the land, these kulaks taking the land and using it. The coal production again increases quite significantly during the periods where he's in charge. We've got the oil production starting to increase but then starting to go down again, and then we've got the iron increasing as well over this period. So it is actually seems to be working. It is leading to more prosperity in Russia, but obviously that is not going to trickle down to the people for very long, because in 1914 the war starts and those things need to then be focused towards the war. In terms of the workers' conditions, he allows the formation of trade unions sort of in 1905, Nicholas does, and in 1912 safety inspectors are then introduced into factories. Workers start to benefit from employee insurance schemes, which pretty much provide protection against accidents and illnesses, so if they were off work ill or hurt, they would still be paid for a period, and it looks like it's going really, really well. However, in 1912, in the Lena goldfields, there was a general strike which emphasised that though on paper it maybe looks really good and in theory it looks really good, there was still a great deal of discontent within the workers. And though the factories did introduce these things, the reality was that most employees didn't have the chance to take opportunities to actually be off work. They were given safety inspections certainly, but it didn't mean that things would actually be changed. Their conditions didn't really get much better. During this particular strike, hundreds of the protesters were then killed by the army and the police, because remember, that's the Tsar's favourite way to deal with protesters, and it becomes really clear that despite what Stoplin is actually doing, or he had put in place before his assassination, that opposition to the Tsarist state is starting to increase again, which we could expect when things stop happening the way that they had been under Stoplin's control. So the question is this new minister the saviour of the Tsar, or could he have been? He definitely tried to boost Russia's industries, and there is an impressive amount of economic growth in Russia between 1908 and 1911 when he's really in power, but realistically they are still really far behind the modern industrial powers, for example Britain, Germany and the USA in 1911. The urban workers' wages are still very low, the cost of food and housing is still very high, and the living and working conditions do remain appalling. They don't change that much. The profits that are being made by industry are going to the capitalists, or they're being paid back to the banks in France that had really loaned the money to Stoplin to actually do these things for pretty much most of this industrial growth. So it wasn't as if this economy was booming for the people. It was starting to, but it wasn't really starting to line their pockets or improve their lives ultimately. So maybe a bit of a stopgap for poor Stoplin and his development really. So he's assassinated in 1911, which is a bit of a boo-hoo moment as far as the Tsar's concerned, because he was about to sack him anyway. He was genuinely worried that Stoplin was going to change too much, and he had actually already blocked some of the plans for things like basic education for the people and factory worker regulations, which would see set work days and hours, which would have improved on the working conditions that the people were still arguing about. The Tsar was greatly influenced by members of the court and the landlords and members of the court who had basically seen these reforms as a threat to the traditional Russian Orthodox society, where everybody knew their place, and it was definitely in that pyramid idea. So he was going to fire him, he was assassinated, and the Tsar ordered for the investigation into his assassination to be stopped, which we can all kind of go about, because that seems a bit strange considering how brutally he is repressing any and all other sorts of forms of revolution. You would assume assassinating the Tsar's Prime Minister would be right up there with things that you would investigate, but apparently not. So after this, the relationship between the Tsar and his people starts to become steadily worse, and then the economy starts to take a downturn in 1912, which causes unemployment and hunger, and people start to become hungry and revolutionary again, which is an issue that they need to then think about dealing with. So, task for you to do, and you can upload this one to the team, is using the pages 47 to 55 to complete the table of what you think Stoplin did and whether you think he could have saved the Tsar. You can say whether or not it's a positive or negative contribution, or if it's difficult to tell, and then you can give your opinion in the channel if you think he really could have been the saviour of the Tsar or not, and why you think that. This is a really nice table that kind of shows quite a lot about the attitudes to the Tsarist regime during this period. So you've got 1905, where things were at their most revolutionary, shall we say, and there are 13,995 strikes with an inordinate amount of strikers taking part across Russia. A year later, this has dropped. Again, the strikers have dropped. 1907, dropping still. Think about the October Manifesto is one reason for this. The brutal suppression is another, so that by 1908, after Stoplin is now in power, it is actually quite significantly lower compared to where it was in 1905. And over Stoplin's time in control and the Dumas and things like that, it does actually stay quite low. And then you have the fact that the Tsar starts blocking these reforms, and he starts to keep the repression going, but the amount that they were getting starts to come to a kind of a stop. As long as those two things are going side by side, the repression doesn't seem to have as much of a bite to it. But as soon as they stop getting, that's when they start to become unhappy again. And from that point, you start to see these numbers going up again. So 1911, when he's assassinated, Stoplin's assassinated, it has doubled over that period. By 1912, it's quite high again. By 1913, it's higher still, and then by 1914, it is higher still. The number of strikes are going up, and the number of strikers are definitely going up as well. So you can think about this yourself. What does that actually tell you about the Tsarist regime at this point in time? Why is it that they are maybe becoming more likely to have a revolution in the kind of the 19s period, whereas in the 1905 bit they were happy for it to be stopped by the October Manifesto? What is happening to the people, and what do they not like? After Stoplin died, and we have this sort of start of the strikes and the strikers to increase, the economy definitely take a downturn. There's a lot of employment sort of downturns, there's a lot of rationing issues starting to become a problem for food, and hunger starts to become an issue as well. And the government try to basically quell the unrest. So they start to practice discrimination against the groups they are saying is responsible. So the Jews, the Muslims, other minority groups. It's kind of class warfare, and it is quite popular. Now, class warfare is going to become a really important theme that we're going to see moving forward with each of the different leaders of Russia from this point onward, so keep that in mind. In 1913, there is a brief pause in rest due to the tricentennial celebrations, and things are doing quite nicely, and people are kind of happy for a little bit. But afterwards, we've got unrest increasing, especially amongst the workers. So we've got the goldfield strikes, where the troops then shoot the workers, and it becomes an issue. One of the Conservative Duma members in 1913 said this, which is a fantastic piece of historiography you can use in an essay. That's him there, he's got fantastic glasses on. And he said, "Let those in power make no mistake about the mood of the people. Never were the Russian people so profoundly revolutionised by the actions of the government, for day to day faith in the government is steadily waning." So he's basically issuing them with a warning. 1905 was the chance to make changes, and though he has made some changes, it's not enough to basically keep the people on side for too long. And this is him saying it is starting to get to that point in time. Other evidence that the Tsar is incompetent as a leader starts to become clear during this period by the appointments of who he actually allows into his home and as one of his advisors. And then one man in particular who we're going to come back to, Gregory Yamovich, which you might know better as Rasputin, had gained quite a lot of influence for being one of the only people who could stop the Tsar's fits of haemophilia and things like that when he was quite ill. And he was seen as a holy man. Now, his power of kind of hypnosis or whatever it was, his ability to keep the young Tsarevich in healthy sort of condition, meant that Alexandra, Nicholas's wife, was very keen for him to be on the sort of advisors panel, and she listened to him, and he very much had her ear, and then in turn had Nicholas's as a result of this. So he freely gave advice on how he felt Russia should be run. He was a drunkard, a womanizer, even his name itself means disreputable, and the Tsar's opponents really seized on Rasputin as an example of how the Tsar was unfit to rule because of the type of people that he was allowing into his kind of inner circle. And more, the people of the court who didn't like Rasputin and didn't like Alexandra anyway, were very keen to remove Rasputin to kind of show that Nicholas was not an idiot who was just taking advice from these random people, but he ignored all of these things because either he didn't know about how much they hated him, or he didn't really care because his wife was very much for having this person there, and he obviously did what she wanted him to do. Cartoons and images from the time really kind of show this. This one's a really good one. A Russian cartoon, the caption reads, "The Russian Tsars at home." So it's almost like Rasputin's this big figure which has control over them both, and Nicholas is sitting there not really looking overly bothered, but obviously Rasputin's got his hand around Alexandra, and she seems to be looking up at him, doting over him. The other one shows basically how Rasputin influenced the Tsar's court, and it seems like he's in the middle with the people around about him, and that he's going to pretty much just be the centre of attention there. So we will come back to Rasputin as one of the sort of downfall factors for Nicholas when we talk about the long and short term causes of the February Revolution, but he is important to keep in mind just now. So the question becomes, by 1914, at the end of these kind of troubled years, how well governed was Russia? And there are 5 characteristics that you might expect to find in a good government. The first is it tries to improve the lives of its people. The second is it builds up its agriculture and industry. The third is it listens to and responds to its population in some way for whatever they're asking for. It runs the country efficiently and makes sure that everything works on time, and it defends the country from enemies. So for this task, you don't have to hand it in, but do it in your notes or in your jotter. I want you to, on a scale of 1 to 5, say how well you think the Tsarish government did each one of these things. So 1 being absolutely terribly, and 5 being, oh my god, they are the best government in the world. Give them a score and kind of think about why you've decided that particular score goes with each one. And then make a list of what you think are the successes and the failures, so you can do it as a T-chart of the Tsarist government up to 1914. What are his successes, what are his failures, and then decide out of the following assessments which one do you most agree with. So by 1913 the government was A, in crisis, B, strong but with some serious weaknesses, or C, secure with only minor weaknesses. And you can post this one in particular to the assignment tab. It'll come up and it'll show you what you need to do for that. So this slide in particular, you can put the information up on the assignment tab. Okay, just a couple of things to kind of keep you amused with this. If you're interested, this YouTube link here will take you to the Bee Gees song Staying Alive, and I did not rewrite this, just one of my colleagues did. So I'm giving you the first half of a new Stability in Russia During the Troubled Years song to the Bee Gees Staying Alive, and you can play the song if you want and have a read of the lyrics, just the first half of them, and see what you think about that, purely to entertain yourselves, and because you know how sad I am that way with songs and history, and that I like to do those things. Last task for this particular PowerPoint, the question becomes then, by 1914, how revolutionary really was Russia? So pages 55 to 58 in the textbook, and complete this focus group table on page 55 as you go. So draw it out, and how far do you think each of these groups was potentially a revolutionary threat, and then how much in reality were they a revolutionary threat? So you could even give them a 1 to 5 scale if you want as well. So you would just have to put If you think potentially were they a revolutionary threat in 1914, so you think yes they were, you could put them at a 4 or a 5 and then just say why you think that. And then when you've had a read of the information, you can then put whatever number you think it really should have been in 1914 and why the reality was that particular number, and fill that in. If you've got any questions about that or the instructions with how to fill that in, obviously give me a shout and let me know on the team and I'll be happy to help you. So the last kind of thing, you don't have to do this, but just if you have access to Netflix and you are interested, this series, The Last of the Tsars, is particularly good, and so far the information that we've covered in the lessons about Nicholas and things like that are the first 3 episodes, with a little bit of more information as things go. So if you wanted to go and check these out, these are particularly good. There's some really good information, and you can kind of see all these things that we've been talking about happening in this kind of documentary drama sort of situation, which is quite good to kill some time if you are looking for some more information or something to do with the topic. So I will post this and I will put up the assignment for what you are having to do, and you can let me know if you have any questions or anything that you're not sure about, and good luck with this week's class.